If I asked you to pick a disturbing movie that stuck with you, which one first comes to mind? Serbian film? Trauma? Speak No Evil? Cuties? I mean, a movie with 11-year-olds twerking is a totally different level of dark and disturbing. But now I want you to think of a disturbing plot twist that stuck with you. Out of all the ones you've thought of, I bet all my money that we don't have the same one in mind. I'd like to take a short moment of your time to introduce you to a thriller that you probably have never heard of before. The Baby, a psychological horror film released in 1973, directed by Ted Post. I accidentally discovered this movie while scrolling on Shudder one day, and not only was I disturbed, I was actually impressed. Dare I say, The Baby is not only unsettling, but it has to have one of the craziest, most unexpected plot twists in the history of plot twists. The movie as a whole stuck with me for a significant amount of time, and I want it to stick with you too. So let's move on over and take a deep dive into Ted Post's The Baby. This is a description given to us about The Baby. A social worker, still reeling from the loss of her architect husband, investigates the eccentric, psychedelic Wadsworth family, consisting of a mother, 2 daughters, and an adult son with the apparent mental capacity of an infant. Now, this sounds relatively tame, right? Until you realize they left out a very, very crucial detail. Yeah, the adult son with the mental capacity of an infant is not who you think. It's not implied that he's disabled, no. We are introduced to a 21-year-old man who has been brainwashed and basically forced to stay in an infant-like state since he was born. All this is done by his mother and his sisters, who are tasked with keeping him in line. I know, just stay with me for a couple more minutes. Because right from the description, we don't have much to work on, nor does it prepare us for what's to come. The Baby is one of those slow burns, but the difference is that the plot starts off weird, and it gets increasingly more weird and uncomfortable as we go through the rest of the story, which is why I think The Baby does its job of being disturbing so well. Most disturbing movies tend to start off normal, and then slowly rip the rose-tinted glasses off to go into the unsettling aspects. But since The Baby starts off weird right at the beginning, you have the audience wondering what could possibly happen next that's even weirder than what we saw in the first 20 minutes. Alright, so I think I yapped a little bit too much. Let's get into what you're waiting for, the plot of The Baby. So the movie starts off with one of our main characters, Anne. In the opening credits, she's examining her file that consists of pictures and documents of the Wadsworth's son. As the pictures progress, we see him go from infant to young boy, teen, and adult. The common theme being that he's still in diapers and actually crawling. Anne's mother-in-law walks in and sees the pictures herself, examining them as well, while giving each other looks. Some day later, we see Anne go to the Wadsworth's home, where we are introduced to Mrs. Wadsworth and her 2 daughters, Alba and Germaine. We get more backstory on the family. Mrs. Wadsworth's husband left the family before her son was born, and we learn that the son's name is just Baby. We don't know if they never gave him a real name or if they're keeping it a secret. Anne says that she needs to see Baby as part of her visit, so the women take her to his room where he is taking a nap. This is our first introduction to Baby, and we see that he's not exactly a young child. Like we established earlier in the video, Baby is actually a grown man who appears to have the mental capacity of an infant. And it's never specified by Mrs. Wadsworth if this was a condition that he has or if he's disabled in any way. This is just how he is. The way Anne looks at Baby in this scene is, she's in a bit of a trance while looking at him. She has more of these, just staring into nothing moments a few more times in the movie, you'll see. It's implied very early on that Anne has a particular interest in this case. There's even a scene later where her boss has a meeting with her. It's revealed that she's been putting her other cases to the side, doing most of her checkups solely on the Wadsworths for weeks. He wants her to chill out, but she insists that she needs to stay on the case as she suspects something is not right with the Wadsworth woman and Baby. To sidetrack, it's never implied that Baby is 100% aware of his true situation, but he is aware that he isn't allowed to do certain actions that he sees other adults do, such as stand and talk. So while my analysis leads me to believe that baby isn't 100% conscious of the fact that he's a grown-ass man, he does seem to know that his current situation isn't great either. Like, he might know something is off, but not the entire scale of it. But we have to realize this is all he's known. It's sadly the norm for him. Add in the factor of abuse and neglect from the Wadsworth women, baby is either too far gone, or it's going to take a lot of work to help him fully break out of his shell without fear of being punished. Around the 20-minute mark, we get to our first of many weird scenes in the movie. The Wadsworth women go out for dinner, and they leave baby at home with the sitter. Things are normal. The babysitter is talking on the phone with her boyfriend, but then she hears baby start to throw a tantrum. The babysitter goes up to his nursery and changes his diaper. By the way this scene was filmed made me feel very, very weird. It's just kind of uncomfortable, low-key. He's still crying, so she tries to comfort him, and they play catch the ball, but he gets a little too silly and bumps his head. Baby's crying, the babysitter hugs him, and he's low-key during all this reaching for her breast. And at first she's like, oh no, baby, stop. But then it looks like she's getting into it and decides, hey, maybe he's just hungry. Let me just pop a titty out and breastfeed him. Yeah. This part made me feel a whole bunch of emotions, because on a real note, regardless of whether or not baby is a 21-year-old man, he still has the mind of no more than a 3-year-old. So no matter how you frame it, it's still very wrong. The sitter looks like she's enjoying this breastfeeding way too much, and right on cue, the Wadsworth women come back home and decide to check on baby in his nursery. And oh boy, they catch the sitter with the titties out, and Mrs. Wadsworth is not happy.
No, nothing really happened, honest. Nothing happened? With your damn tit in his mouth, and you call that nothing? You lying bitch! You have to believe whatever.
Mrs. Wadsworth ends up beating the crap out of the sister. Like, she's got a bloody nose. She gets thrown to the ground. The sisters grab her and rough her up a little bit. Mrs. Wadsworth grabs a belt and just basically starts whipping her on top of that. Like, looking at this a little bit closely, I think the babysitter really could have died from all these injuries had they gone further. But eventually Jermaine stops Mrs. Wadsworth, because not only is baby in the corner crying, they don't need any more unnecessary attention on themselves if they somehow accidentally kill the sitter or if they beat her too badly. Alba and Jermaine grab the sitter. Alba and Jermaine pick up the sitter, dragging her out while threatening that if she says anything about what happened, they'll press charges on her for engaging in sexual behavior with baby. My face throughout this entire scene was literally just this.
Miss Jackson!
The entire time. I mentioned before, we're getting weird very early on, so it kind of messes with your brain, right? Like, if this is happening just 20 minutes into the movie, what more is going to happen in the next hour that's going to top all of that? After that mess of a scene, we fast forward to another one of Anne's visits to the Wads. I'm giving up on saying Wadsworth 50 times in 3 sentences, so from here on out, they are the Wads. Throughout these next couple of visits, we see Anne is attempting to help baby grow up in a sense, helping him try to stand up and communicate. During this particular visit, Anne successfully helps baby stand on his 2 feet, but right on cue, Mrs. Wad comes home and looks very upset at this attempted stand. Anne suggests to Mrs. Wad to do more of this to help baby break out of his baby form and reach his full potential. However, Mrs. Wad is not having any of it, and she just looks so evil and so scary in this scene. It's actually like nerve-wracking to watch her face when she's approaching baby. And the scene cuts immediately to Alba in the nursery with baby, and she pulls out a freaking cattle prod and proceeds to zap baby with the prod as punishment for standing. She pokes him while repeating the words, "Baby doesn't walk, baby doesn't talk, baby doesn't stand, baby doesn't speak to strangers." And Lord have mercy, I can't accurately describe how this scene made me feel, because it's shot in a goofy way, so I want to laugh, but I can't forget that this is a helpless man who's subjected to abuse to stay like a baby all of his life. So it's like, this is just one glimpse into something that's probably been happening for 21 years. Like, I want to say, bro, get the fuck up and whack this hoe, but I can't, because he's either too scared to, or he physically cannot defend himself. Eventually, Jermaine comes in and stops Alba from going too far, and up until this point, I can safely say that both sisters, for some reason, are messed up themselves. Whether or not that's due to Mrs. Wadsworth, we don't know, but Jermaine seemed like the better of the sisters up until this point. Like, she's obviously part of the whole thing to keep baby infantile, but she's always seemed to look out for him and stop the abuse from going too far. That is until there's a very, very unsettling scene. Trigger warning ahead. This is the timestamp for when the explicit details of the scene recap is over. One night, Jermaine sneaks into baby's room and watches him sleep in his crib. She just stands there and stares at him for a few seconds. She then slowly opens the crib door, takes off her nightgown, and climbs into his crib. The screen goes black. It is implied that Jermaine unfortunately rapes baby, or at the very least molests him. Luckily, it cuts off as she is climbing into the crib, so we can only imagine. But the sad part is, this is most likely not the first time she has done this. So not only is baby being abused mentally and physically, but also sexually. And you can imagine everyone watching in the audience is probably pissed off and are rooting for Anne to come in and save the day sooner rather than later. The rest of the film from here on is basically dragged out filler. Like, it's somewhat relevant to the plot in terms of giving more context and progressing the story, but I can be very brief and still give you that same context. So I forgot to mention that Anne is implied to be widowed. There's a short scene earlier where Jermaine asks Anne about her husband, but she seems to want to avoid that question. Later, Anne and her mother-in-law are looking at a slideshow of Anne and her husband. We learn that there was an accident, and she claims, "It should have been me. It was my fault." But she never explicitly says he's dead, nor does she say that he's currently hospitalized either. This is important later. There's also a scene where Anne visits a school for exceptional children and just stares at them, similar to the way that she was staring at baby earlier on in the movie. She seems to have a non-predatory interest in children, but reveals earlier to Mrs. Watt that she doesn't have children of her own. So we can only assume that maybe she was trying to have children with her husband before the accident, or maybe she's unable to conceive entirely. It's never explicitly said. This is all just theory and implication. We have another scene where she's trying to bring more attention to the Wads, suggesting to her supervisor that Mrs. Watt is doing all this to baby to punish him for being the only male in the family as revenge for being left by all her husbands. And of course her supervisors and her boss is like, "Oh my gosh, Anne, there's no concrete evidence, just leave it alone, drop it before we get in trouble, blah blah blah." And just around the same time, Anne receives a call that the Wads have apparently filed a complaint against her, but it's never explicitly said what the complaint was about. So Anne confronts the Wadsworths, threatening to report them to the public guardian for their suspicious behavior. When she arrives home, Anne receives a phone call, and it's Mrs. Wad, apologizing for their behavior towards Anne. To make it up to her, she invites Anne to baby's birthday party, to see him in a social setting and squash any misunderstandings about his treatment. How can they be so cruel if we're having a party and inviting people around him, right? Nothing much happens at the beginning. Anne watches baby from afar. One of Alba's boo things, his name is Dennis, tries to make a move on Anne. The party people are dancing and baby is just crawling around. Anne throughout the party has declined in drinking alcohol, but she's given a signal from her mother to pour a glass of spiked punch into a glass and swap it for Anne's normal punch while she's distracted. Eventually, Anne gets drunk from the drink, and the sisters pretend to help her out of the house. But when no one's looking, they end up bringing Anne back into the house and bring her to the basement. And we find Mrs. Wad down there, waiting. The sisters are ordered to tie her up and gag her, Mrs. Wad ready to beat up Anne like she did that babysitter. However, Dennis starts knocking on the door looking for Alba. Worried about being caught, Mrs. Wad orders Alba to go back up to distract him, while Jermaine and Mrs. Wad leave Anne down in the basement. I'm going to be very brief for the next part because it's a bit drawn out. Baby finds his way into the basement and Anne is trying to get him to help her, but baby being, well, a baby isn't helping much. So we watch Anne escape all on her own while baby is just sitting there. It's low-key kind of funny if you don't take it seriously. She successfully escapes and brings baby with her out of the house and into her car without anyone noticing. Once all the guests leave, the Wads return to the basement only to realize that Anne has escaped and baby is missing. They attempt to drive after her, but Anne is one step ahead of them, puncturing the car's tire before she had left. The women wait in their living room, assuming that Anne is reporting them to the police and waiting for a phone call of some kind. But Mrs. Wad claims there won't be a phone call. Anne has what she wants, and it's baby. We cut to Anne in her home, taking care of baby, giving him a bath, putting a suit on him, and more. And we cut back to the Wads to see how they're doing, and Mrs. Wad and the sisters are going through it. You might be wondering, why don't they just call the police? Well, obviously, they don't want any negative attention brought to them. I'm assuming if the police are involved, they may ask more questions about baby, he might be mandated to be examined, or even take him away because he was kidnapped while they left him unattended during a party surrounded by alcohol. Okay, so why not just find Anne and confront her? Well, we'll get to that. We revisit Anne at her house and see that she has people working in her backyard to build a pool. Anne's mother-in-law, Judith, asks Anne if she's having second thoughts, also mentioning her worry about turning into the Wadsworths. But Anne is certain, saying,
Judith, we could never be like them.
Anne gets baby to stand, albeit with the support of the chair, and snaps a photo of him. She sends the photo of baby standing to the Wads with a letter to taunt them.
Wadsworth family, I am in the process of making baby into a grown man. As I have always suspected, his responses are those of a sensitive and intelligent person. His progress so far proves that beyond a doubt. In a short time, the baby you once knew will no longer exist. Even if circumstances beyond my control force him to return home, it will be too late to reverse his transformation. Your baby is lost to you forever. Good Samaritan.
It's a lie. We've got to get him back before it's too late.
Just tell us what you want, Mama, and we'll do it.
This is the last straw for Mrs. Wad, but this is all part of Anne's plan. She wants them to get angry and come to her house, and they do just that. It's nighttime. The Wads pull up to Anne's house. Jermaine enters first, finding baby's toy on the floor and the door unlocked. She walks in, pulling a gun out from her purse. She hears what appears to be baby crying with Anne in the same room. Alba follows in shortly after, while Mrs. Wad waits in the car. Jermaine slowly makes her way upstairs, approaching the sounds that she hears. Alba finds her way in, getting spooked by something shortly after. Mrs. Wad, worried due to how long it's taking, goes inside herself. She walks around, stopping when she feels something from the ceiling hit her face. She looks up in horror to find Jermaine slumped over the stairs railing, bleeding from her throat. Mrs. Wad runs up the stairs to her lifeless body, confirming she is dead. The door opens behind her, and we see Alba calling out to her. Mrs. Wad approaches Alba, only to discover that she has been fatally stabbed in the back, the knife still inside. She falls to the ground in pain and bleeding out. All of a sudden, Anne bursts out of the door nearby with an axe in hand. She runs toward Mrs. Wad, only to be kicked in the stomach, and ends up dropping the axe. Mrs. Wad grabs the axe and proceeds to chase Anne downstairs. Anne hides, and it gets quiet. Very quiet. Eventually, Anne is found and she dodges Mrs. Wad's axe swing. She runs to the fireplace, picking up a rod, and a pseudo-sword fight ensues. Anne is able to knock the axe from Mrs. Wad's hand and continuing to chase her around the living room with unsuccessful rod hits. Brief pause on Serious Kipsy for 1 second, because Mrs. Wad runs back upstairs only to be met by Judith, who comes out of the room with a freaking machete. Like, damn, Judith! She said, I'm strapped too, bitch, now what? Okay, back to serious Kipsy. Mrs. Wad, surrounded by both women, ultimately decides to jump off the stairs right as they both swing their weapons. She falls down, severely injuring her leg, but still alive. Anne and Judith go downstairs. Judith is about to hack Mrs. Wad in the face, but Anne stops her, saying it's better this way. She tells Judith to grab rope and tie her hands. While Mrs. Wad hears baby crying upstairs, she looks up at Anne, horrified.
My baby. What have you done to my baby? Why do you want my baby? Why do you want him? No, what's going to
Mrs. Wad is dragged out into the backyard, still screaming, What have you done to my baby? What's going to happen to him? You can't have him. Anne pushes Mrs. Wad into a deep ditch, where the pool is set to be built, alongside a dead Germaine and Alba. Anne gags Mrs. Wad, grabs a nearby shovel with Judith, and they proceed to bury the Wadsworth woman, while Mrs. Wadsworth is still alive and fighting against her restraints. The screen goes black. Now some of you might be cheering for Anne, some of you might think she went too far, and the rest of you are left speechless. But remember, we're recapping this movie because of an unexpected twist. This whole sequence is in fact not the twist, that was just the climax. Here is where it somehow gets even crazier than every single thing that I have went through in the last couple of minutes. A door opens and we see baby in a closet, implying this is Anne's version of a punishment for something he probably did earlier. She brings him to the nursery, and I'm just gonna let this play before I continue.
Where's my best worker? There he is! Are you putting up a new building? Hi. Were you lonely all by yourself last night, sweetheart? I know. Wifey loves her big baby husband, yes. Hey, look who's here. Look, it's your playmate. He's coming back. And now he can stay with you always. Come on. Come on, baby. Say hello to Roger. Yes. You do like each other, don't you? Oh, yes. Oh, my two big men. Hey.
Anne's real motives are revealed. Her husband Roger was never dead or stuck in a hospital. The accident they were in left him brain damaged, reducing his mental capacity to that of an infant. And she has been taking care of him this whole time. This is the reason why Anne seems to be a natural with children, even though she had none. This is the reason why she stares at the kids at the school earlier, why she got awkward when Germaine asked about her husband earlier on in the movie. It all comes together and it all makes sense now. This whole time, her special interest in baby was not as pure-hearted as it seemed. She did all of this in order to find her husband a playmate, a brother, so he won't be lonely. The final scene shows Anne, Baby, and Roger in the finished pool in the backyard, Baby being unaware of the fact that his mama and his sister's bodies lie beneath. Judith watches with a smile as Anne and the two infant men are playing and jumping around and having fun in the pool. Pausing at Anne's smile to the camera, the screen fades to black. The end. The story concludes with the implication that Baby, though in the kinder care of Anne, will remain stuck in his infant state along with Roger. It's crazy to find out that Anne was really the anti-hero of the story. We were rooting for her to get Baby out of the abusive environment, but we weren't aware of her true intentions, nor will a lot of people align with her reasoning once they find out the truth. We have to remember that Baby was forced into this lifestyle, and with this conclusion, Anne is indirectly encouraging this lifestyle and in some way continuing the brainwashing of Baby for her own selfish reasons. Because I guarantee you, Roger was not the one telling her to do all this for his own needs. And throughout the movie, we have enough evidence to suggest Baby has the potential to get better, but it does not look like Anne will allow that to happen anytime soon. And that, everyone, is the most unexpected and disturbing plot twist in cinema. Probably top 10, in my opinion. The Baby as a movie is set to give you a roller coaster of emotions and inevitably rip your expectations as to how the story will end. Going back into the movie a second time, all while knowing what's really going on with Anne, gives you a totally different viewing experience. Alright, that brings us to the conclusion of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did not enjoy it, please do not sue me for any emotional damages. Either way, show some love and support to your new favorite space girl. That can be done with a like, share, and especially a click of the subscribe button, because I have more videos coming your way very soon. I appreciate you all for joining me on this wild ride of a movie recap. The next one will be completely opposite from this one, more fun, less crazy. If you'd like to follow me on my other socials, all of those links will be in the description below, including my Patreon and my Ko-fi. Coffee. I don't know which one, how to say it. I stream daily on Twitch as well, if you'd like to come in and chat there. I hope to see you in the next video or in the Twitch streams. Stay safe, stay beautiful, and treat yourself to a donut this week.